Take $20 million and bear my child, no strings attached, David offered. Sounds like an easy choice, right? But what happens when emotions get involved and the deal isn't as simple as it seems? Would she take the offer? Watch to find out. Hey there! If this is your first time here, welcome. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, it really helps the channel grow. Share it with your friends and family so they don't miss out. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you. David sat in his luxurious office, looking out at the city skyline. His empire stretched out before him. An empire he had rebuilt from the ground up when it crumbled. But despite his success, there was an emptiness inside of him. The silence in the office was almost suffocating, a reflection of the hollowness that had settled in his heart years ago. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had once believed in love, in companionship. But that belief had been shattered years ago when Sophia left him for Marcus. She was the one he had thought would be by his side forever, the one he had built his future with. But when his family business faced near bankruptcy, when everything he had worked for seemed to be crumbling, Sophia made the choice to leave. And she didn't just leave him, she left him for his best friend, Marcus. The betrayal was a blow David never recovered from. Marcus, the man who had stood by him, the one he had trusted more than anyone else. The one who had been there for him through thick and thin. How could he have known that Marcus would take the woman he loved? The pain of that betrayal still gnawed at him, lingering in the corners of his mind. And it wasn't just the breakup that hurt, it was the way they had done it. Sophia had walked away as if she had no regrets, no second thoughts. She took Marcus by the hand, and together, they walked out of his life. Just like that. David hadn't loved a woman since. In fact, he hated the very thought of being with one. The idea of a woman close to him now disgusted him. He had no female staff on his floor, and no female assistant had ever made it past the interview stage. His policies were simple: no women. Not in his personal life. Not in his business. His coldness toward women was his way of protecting himself. If he kept them at a distance, he couldn't be hurt again. No woman would ever get close enough to betray him the way Sophia had. And it worked. He built his empire with the anger and bitterness that festered inside him, and it pushed him forward. But now, as his grandfather's health began to decline rapidly, he found himself facing a problem that had nothing to do with business. I won't take another step unless you give me a grandchild, his grandfather had said, his voice weak from the illness. David had scoffed. Grandpa, that's ridiculous. You can't be serious. But his grandfather, a stubborn man, wasn't joking. He had made it clear, no grandchild, no treatment. And with each passing day, David could see the old man weakening. His business empire, his future, everything was on the line. The family legacy depended on it. David hadn't wanted to believe it, but he knew it was true. He had to have a child. And the only way to get one was to find a woman. The thought of it made him nauseous. He didn't want a wife, a lover, or any emotional connection. He didn't need that. All he needed was a child who could carry on his name. He needed a surrogate, someone who would carry the child and then disappear. David stared at his reflection in the window. He knew what he had to do. He picked up the phone. He called his secretary. Find me a woman who will give me a child. I don't care about anything else. It's got to happen now. His secretary hesitated, but only for a moment. Of course, sir. I'll start looking right away. David hung up the phone, his mind already running through the options. He would find someone. He didn't care who. No emotions, no attachments, just a child. That was all he needed. David spent the next few days in a blur, focusing on his work but haunted by the thought of his grandfather's condition. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. The pressure was mounting, and as much as he hated it, he knew he had no choice. He needed a woman. He couldn't just pick anyone, though. He needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, someone who would carry his child and then disappear. He needed a deal, cold, businesslike, with no emotions attached. David's mind kept circling back to his grandfather's ultimatum. A grandchild. The words echoed in his mind, but the thought of being tied to a woman for any length of time filled him with disgust. After several unsuccessful interviews with women who only seemed interested in his money or the status that came with being linked to him, David grew more frustrated. He didn't want a wife, or a lover, or anyone who would get too attached. The only thing he wanted was a child. Then, one day, while visiting his grandfather in the hospital, David's secretary called with an unexpected lead. "There's a young woman, sir. Amelia. She's been helping in the hospital. I thought you might want to meet her," his secretary said. David barely paid attention at first. He wasn't interested in meeting anyone who didn't fit his criteria. But then he heard something that made him pause. "She's poor, and has a brother in need of a kidney transplant. She's been struggling to pay for the procedure," the secretary added. David's interest peaked. This could be the perfect opportunity. She wasn't like the women he had met before, eager for his money or fame. She needed money, and perhaps that was all he needed from her. That afternoon, David visited the hospital. His grandfather's room was quiet, and the sound of heart monitors filled the space as he sat beside the old man. But as David turned to leave, he overheard a conversation in the hallway between Amelia and her doctor. "I don't know what else to do. My brother needs a kidney transplant. We don't have the money for it." Amelia's voice was strained with worry. David's heart skipped a beat. She was desperate. Perfect. He walked toward her, and when she saw him, her face immediately stiffened. She clearly didn't recognize him, and who could blame her? He was used to people seeing him as the powerful billionaire, but for a moment, he felt just like anyone else. "I overheard you. Your brother's situation," David began, his voice cold, though his mind was already turning. Amelia glanced at him, but there was no warmth in her eyes, only the weariness of someone carrying a heavy burden. "What do you want?" she asked, the exhaustion in her voice obvious. David's eyes locked onto hers. "I can help you. I'll pay for the transplant, but I need something from you in return." Amelia blinked, taken aback by his sudden offer. "I'm not sure I understand," she replied, her voice cautious. David didn't waste time explaining everything in great detail. "I need a surrogate. You'll carry my child. I'll pay you $20 million for it, and in return, I'll make sure your brother gets the transplant he needs. Once the child is born, you leave. No strings attached." Her eyes widened as the offer sank in. David could see the shock on her face, but the desperation in her eyes was hard to ignore. "I can't," Amelia started, but David interrupted her. "You can. You need the money, don't you? It's a fair trade. Help me, and your brother will get the surgery he needs. This is the only way for both of us." She looked away, the weight of the decision weighing down on her. After a long pause, she spoke again, quieter this time. David stood there for a moment, studying her face, the uncertainty in her eyes. She was the one. "I'm not asking you for anything beyond the agreement, $20 million. That's the deal. Your brother gets the transplant. And I get an heir," he said, his tone final. Amelia hesitated, but the desperation in her voice was undeniable. "Okay," she finally said, her words heavy with the weight of the decision she was making. "I'll do it." After the deal was signed, and the money promised, Amelia moved into the billionaire's mansion. It was vast, cold, and intimidating, a world far different from the life she had known. But she had no choice. This was the only way to help her brother. The mansion was filled with staff, but there was no one for her to talk to. She felt isolated in the grand, empty house, like a visitor who had overstayed her welcome. The billionaire remained distant, never fully acknowledging her unless it was necessary for the procedure. The IVF was scheduled, but when Amelia arrived at the clinic, the doctor who would perform the procedure looked at her curiously after he examined her. "You're a virgin?" the doctor asked, surprised when Amelia confirmed it. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet, unsure where this conversation was going. The doctor turned to the billionaire, explaining that IVF might not be the best method for someone like Amelia. "Since she's a virgin, it would be far more successful if you did it naturally. There's no need for IVF in this case. A natural conception would give us the highest chances of success," he said, trying to sound professional. David, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, shifted uncomfortably. The thought of doing things naturally with a woman, after everything he had been through, was not something he had prepared for. "You're sure it's the best way?" David asked, his voice colder than usual. He didn't want to touch her, didn't want to even be near her, but he knew this was the quickest way to secure what he needed. The doctor reassured him, explaining that this would be the most effective way to ensure she got pregnant. David, after a moment's hesitation, reluctantly agreed. He would do whatever it took to get his heir. He didn't care about the process, he just needed the result. That night, Amelia moved into one of the mansion's many guest rooms. It was spacious, decorated lavishly, but it felt empty. David didn't return home that evening. The silence of the house was deafening. The next day, David arrived, his demeanor cold and businesslike as always. They had no discussion before the procedure, it was just another transaction to him. They went to his room, and then it was time. Amelia felt a mix of anxiety and sadness. She didn't want to go through this, not like this. But for her brother, she would endure anything. That night, they stood face to face in his bedroom. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with tension. David, a man used to controlling every aspect of his life, was now out of his depth. He had done this for years, made deals, built his empire, but nothing prepared him for this. He was stiff, distant. His eyes avoided hers. She was a means to an end, nothing more. Still, as he touched her, something stirred inside him, something he couldn't explain. She was a stranger, a woman he had no desire for, yet when they finally shared that intimate moment, it was the best night of his life and a strange connection started to form. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was different from what he had expected. There was something about her, something innocent, that made him hesitate. Afterwards, he immediately pulled away, his expression hardening. He didn't want to feel this. He didn't want to feel anything for her. She was just a vessel for his child. But as he lay in bed that night, the flicker of a bond began to grow in his chest. He ignored it. He had to. Days passed. Amelia's pregnancy became the central focus of their lives, yet David continued to avoid her emotionally. He barely saw her. When he did, he spoke to her only when necessary. He stayed busy with his company, disappearing for long hours. His presence in the mansion was fleeting, and when he did come back, it was only to check on the progress of the pregnancy, to make sure everything was on track. Amelia, left alone in the mansion, struggled with loneliness. Her belly was growing, and with each passing day, the reality of what she was carrying settled in. This child wasn't hers. She had no rights to it. It wasn't her future. It wasn't a relationship. It was just a contract. But as the pregnancy progressed, the emptiness she felt inside became harder to ignore. She spent days walking the empty halls, feeling more like a prisoner than a guest. The mansion was cold, even colder without David's presence. His avoidance left her wondering if she had made the right choice. Was this worth it? Would her brother be able to live a full life after the transplant? Was this all just for money? And what about David? He had used her, treated her like a tool. As she looked out the window one evening, watching the dark sky, Amelia wondered if this was all she would ever be, just a vessel. A woman used to carry someone else's child. The thought made her heart heavy, and she realized how much she longed for more than just survival. David had never expected to feel so weak, so vulnerable. He had spent the last few years focusing solely on his empire, his business, and his success. Emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford. But when he saw Sophia standing with Marcus, his best friend, everything he had built started to crumble. It had been years since Sophia had left him, but seeing her again was like reopening an old wound. The woman who had once promised him forever was now in the arms of the man who had betrayed him. Marcus, his closest friend, had stolen the one thing David had ever truly cared about. And it had happened at the worst possible time, when his family business was on the brink of bankruptcy. While David was struggling to save his legacy, Sophia and Marcus had been having an affair behind his back. The anger, the jealousy, the hurt, it all came rushing back in an instant. David couldn't breathe. He watched them laugh together, their connection so obvious, so intimate. His hands clenched into fists as his chest tightened. It was a pain that felt fresh, as if it had just happened yesterday. He had never fully healed from the betrayal, and seeing it all over again shattered him in ways he couldn't explain. The sight of them together, laughing, talking like everything was normal, destroyed him. In that moment, David wasn't the billionaire CEO, he was just a man, heartbroken and drowning in the weight of his own emotions. He couldn't stay there any longer. Overcome with jealousy and heartbreak, David stormed out of the restaurant. His mind raced as he made his way back to the mansion. The world around him seemed to blur. His thoughts were clouded, and he could barely make sense of anything. He wasn't angry at Sophia anymore. He was angry at himself, for being foolish enough to trust Marcus, for letting his guard down, for letting himself care in the first place. When David got back to the mansion, he was a mess. His emotions were too much to handle, too heavy for him to carry alone. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey and drank it quickly, trying to numb the pain that was eating him from the inside out. His hands shook, his thoughts were scattered, and before long, the alcohol took hold of him. David didn't know how much time had passed when he found himself stumbling through the quiet halls of the mansion, unable to think straight. He was lost in a haze of confusion and anger, his mind replaying the scene of Sophia and Marcus over and over. Without realizing what he was doing, he found himself standing in front of Amelia's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open without thinking. He didn't know why he was here, only that he needed something he'd put into words. Amelia was sitting by the window, reading. She turned when she heard the door open. Her eyes widened when she saw David standing there, swaying slightly. "David?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer. Instead, he staggered forward, falling onto the bed beside her. His head was spinning, and he couldn't focus. The anger, the heartbreak, everything was swirling inside him, and all he could do was sit there, not knowing what to do next. Amelia didn't know what to make of the situation, but something in her softened. She could see the pain in his eyes, even though he was trying to hide it. She had seen him cold and distant before, but this was different. "David, you're drunk," she said gently, moving closer to him. David didn't respond. He simply let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his face with his hands. He was in a vulnerable place, and the walls he had so carefully built around himself began to crumble. Amelia hesitated for a moment, but then she stood up and grabbed a towel. "Let me help you." David barely reacted. She helped him change his clothes, wiping his face gently, taking care of him in a way that no one else had. She could feel the heat of his frustration and pain, and for a brief moment, she didn't see the billionaire who had made her life complicated. She saw just a man in need. He was trembling. His anger was still there, but it had been replaced by something else, something deeper. Something he didn't want to acknowledge. And as Amelia helped him settle into bed, she couldn't help but feel a shift between them. It wasn't just about the money, the contract, or the child anymore. There was something raw and honest between them, something neither of them had expected. David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room felt different now. Not just because of the alcohol clouding his senses, but because of the quiet connection he had with Amelia. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. He didn't want to admit it, but he was grateful for her. As Amelia pulled the covers up around him, she paused for a moment, watching him closely. He was vulnerable, and for once, she could see the man behind the mask. David's eyes fluttered closed, and he mumbled, "Thank you." It was the first time he had shown any gratitude towards her, and it hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, everything was still. David had shifted. She could feel it. He was no longer the distant billionaire she had agreed to bear a child for. He was a man who was broken, and somehow, she had become the one to help him pick up the pieces. David couldn't ignore the change inside him, even though he tried. Ever since that night, when Amelia had cared for him in his broken state, things had felt different. The walls he had spent years building, those walls that kept everyone out, had cracked just a little. And the woman who had been nothing more than a contract was now something else. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but when he found himself looking for reasons to spend more time around her, he couldn't lie to himself anymore. It started small. A check-in here and there, just to make sure she was comfortable, to see how the pregnancy was progressing. Nothing more than business. But slowly, his visits became more frequent. He would knock on her door just to see how she was doing, to ask about her well-being. It was never a long conversation, but he found himself lingering, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made him uncomfortable. Amelia noticed. At first, she thought it was just part of the arrangement, the cold, businesslike deal they had made. But something had changed in David. He wasn't the same distant, emotionless billionaire who had barely looked her in the eye when they first met. Now, he seemed to care, at least in his own way. As her pregnancy progressed, she could feel the shift in him. He had started to check in more often, and his gaze no longer seemed so indifferent. It was subtle, but it was there. And every time he asked how she was feeling, or how the baby was doing, it felt a little less like a transaction and more like concern. Still, Amelia kept her distance emotionally. She reminded herself every day why she was here. This wasn't about her feelings. It wasn't about him. She had a responsibility to her brother, and the money David had promised was the only thing that would save him. Everything else didn't matter. Yet, no matter how much she tried to push it away, the feelings were starting to grow. One evening, as she sat in the living room, her hand gently resting on her growing belly, she felt David's eyes on her. He hadn't said anything, but she could tell he was watching her. His face was hard, but his gaze was soft, almost thoughtful. She quickly looked away, as if she could block out the thoughts that were starting to form. No, she reminded herself. You cannot get attached. You're here for a purpose. But it was getting harder to ignore the connection between them. David had begun to show small signs of protectiveness. He would often check in on her after the long hours of work, asking if she needed anything. He even arranged for more comfortable furniture for her room. Little things that she knew weren't just part of the agreement. They were him making an effort, even if he didn't realize it himself. One night, she found herself watching him from across the room. His back was turned, as he spoke with his assistant on the phone, but there was something different about him. He had his usual, controlled demeanor, but there was an exhaustion in his eyes. It wasn't just from his work, she realized. It was from something deeper, something that had nothing to do with his business. Amelia couldn't help herself. She found herself wondering about him. What had happened to make him so cold? Why was he so distant from everyone, including her? And what had he been through that had shaped him into the man he was now? But she quickly shook the thoughts away. She couldn't afford to fall into that trap. She had to stay focused. The child she was carrying wasn't hers. It was David's. And once this was all over, she would leave. There could be no other outcome. No matter how much David seemed to care, no matter how much she felt drawn to him, this was just business. As she rubbed her belly, she whispered to herself, "Just get through this. Help your brother. That's all that matters." David couldn't escape the thoughts that haunted him every day. Every time he looked at Amelia, something shifted inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He had spent so much of his life building walls, pushing everyone away, telling himself that emotions were a weakness. But with Amelia, those walls were starting to crumble. It wasn't just the pregnancy that kept him coming back to her, though. It wasn't just the business deal that had brought her into his life. It was her. He had tried to deny it, tried to push those feelings down, but they kept resurfacing. He couldn't stop himself from wanting to be around her, from caring about her more than he had ever planned to. She was carrying his child, yes, but it was more than that. She was different. She had become someone he trusted, someone he wanted to protect, even if he didn't fully understand why. That night, he found himself standing outside her door again, his hand resting on the doorknob. He had been avoiding this moment, this conversation, for weeks. But tonight, the need to say it out loud was too strong to ignore. Amelia was sitting on the edge of her bed, her hand on her stomach, as she often did when she thought no one was looking. When she saw him, she was surprised but didn't ask what brought him to her room. She just waited for him to speak. "Amelia," David began, his voice lower than usual. "I don't know how to say this, but I need to be honest with you." Her heart skipped a beat. Was this just another business conversation? Another way of him reminding her that she was here for one reason and one reason only? David took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had never been good with emotions, but something inside him was pushing him to speak the truth. "I don't know what this is, but I've been fighting it. Fighting you." Amelia felt a strange flutter in her chest. "Fighting me?" She had expected him to say something cold, businesslike, maybe even dismissive, but this was different. His eyes were full of something she hadn't seen before, vulnerability. "I've been distant. I know I have. And I've told myself it was because you're just my surrogate, just someone here to carry my child. But that's not all this is. I care about you, Amelia. More than I ever expected, more than I want to admit." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, unsure if she had heard him right. "David," she started, her voice shaky. "We're not supposed to." "I know," he interrupted, stepping closer. I know this isn't supposed to be anything more than a deal. But it is more. I've tried to push it aside, but I can't. You've been kind to me when no one else has. You've cared for me, and, damn it, I've felt it. And I don't want to pretend anymore. Silence hung between them. David's confession felt like a weight lifting off his chest, but it also brought a flood of emotions he wasn't prepared to deal with. Amelia could feel her heart racing. This wasn't just business anymore. This wasn't just about money or a contract. This was real. Before she could respond, he closed the distance between them and kissed her. It wasn't like the cold, calculated kiss they shared when they first agreed to the arrangement. This one was tender, filled with all the emotions they had both been fighting. It was a kiss that told her everything he had just admitted, without needing any words. When they broke apart, David looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and longing. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want it to be like this." Amelia felt a storm of emotions inside her. She had never expected this. She had always kept her distance, focusing on the reason she was here. But now, with his confession, it felt impossible to keep her heart locked away. "I don't know what this is," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm here for your child, not for us. I have to keep reminding myself of that." David stepped back, pain flashing across his face. "I know. I get it. But I can't pretend I don't want this, want you?" Amelia didn't know what to say. Her feelings were torn. She had wanted to keep everything simple, to avoid getting too involved. But now, with David so close, with everything he had just confessed, the line between right and wrong was blurring. That night, despite the confusion and uncertainty, they slept together, not just as a surrogate and her employer, but as two people who had crossed an invisible line, who were both trying to navigate a path neither of them was prepared for. David kissed her deeply and caressed her, and he didn't let go until they were tired. As the days went on, Amelia's pregnancy progressed, and David's behavior began to change. He wasn't just checking in on her now, he was acting more like a partner. He would stay longer when he visited her, help her with anything she needed, and show a tenderness that was new for him. It wasn't just about the baby anymore. David, for the first time in years, felt something he hadn't thought possible: happiness, fulfillment. He wasn't just living for his empire anymore. He was living for something else, someone else. He was starting to feel alive again. But it wasn't without its struggles. David's past, the betrayal, his fear of trusting women, still haunted him. He wasn't sure how to handle the emotions building up inside him. He knew he had feelings for Amelia, but he couldn't shake the bitterness and fear that came with loving anyone. But every time he looked at her, he couldn't deny it. Something real was growing between them, something neither of them had planned on. As the days passed, David found himself becoming more protective of Amelia, more invested in their future. He also made her move to his room, though he still tried to deny it. The connection they shared was undeniable. And it scared him. David didn't expect to see her again. He had buried those memories deep, but when his ex-girlfriend, Sophia, appeared in the lobby of his office, it was like a storm had suddenly hit. She stood there, smiling in that way she knew always got to him, a smile that had once made him believe in everything he'd ever wanted. But now, all he could feel was anger. She didn't waste time. "I see you've moved on," Sophia said, her voice dripping with the same charm that had won him over years ago. David didn't say anything at first. His jaw clenched as he stared at her. How dare she show up now? After everything she had put him through? After leaving him for Marcus, the one man who should have been his closest ally, and taking the best part of his life with her? "Why are you here, Sophia?" His voice was colder than he meant it to be. He was better than this. He had to be. But he was still raw from that betrayal. Sophia smiled like she knew she had the upper hand. "I came to tell you something. I know about her." David's blood ran cold. He didn't have to ask who she was talking about. "Amelia?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. She nodded slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "I know all about your little arrangement. I'm surprised you didn't think I would find out. A woman like that, she's only interested in one thing, David. Money." The words cut through him. Money? His stomach twisted at the accusation. Sophia continued, "She's using you. You can't honestly believe she's doing this out of the goodness of her heart, can you?" David felt a flash of anger, but he shoved it down. He had to stay calm. He couldn't let Sophia get to him again. But she had already planted the seed of doubt in his mind. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said through gritted teeth. "Amelia has never asked for a penny. She's doing this for her brother." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "I'm sure you think that. But it doesn't matter. I told your grandfather. He needs to know the truth. She's only using you to get what she wants, and I'm going to make sure he sees that." David's world tilted. His grandfather?